God. Well, I have to say, I first met God as a bully. I grew up Unitarian in Charleston, West Virginia, and the God that my Baptist neighbors knew did not much care for my family. We were weird, we were offbeat, and so I first heard about God, not at church, not at my fellowship that I went to on Sunday. There we were talking about nature, and we were talking about things like miracles in the natural world, but God, not so much. My neighbors, on the other hand, had a lot to say about God. And what they had to say about God was pretty much, God hates people like you. In a way, that was really handy for me later when I came out as a lesbian, because I'd already met this God of damnation. And when I went home as a kid and told my mom that the neighbor said God was sending me to hell, my mom just kind of looked at me and shook her head and said, they don't know what they're talking about. In a way, everyone who's a religious minority surrounded by fundamentalists is going to experience God in this bullying kind of a way. Perhaps you did too. When you meet God as a bully, it takes a while to shift and to know a different God. And so today I just want to share a little bit of my own journey with that so that perhaps you can find yourself in it. And so I grew up kind of, I would say, almost a fundamentalist atheist, because I knew that this God that my neighbors believed in, I didn't believe in. Because theirs was the only God I ever really heard about, I figured you either believed in that God or you were an atheist. And so I said, I'm an atheist. And I must admit, I was a little bit snotty about that. You know, a little bit like smug, like I was just smarter than they were. I was just kind of better than they were. Kind of like a weird take on holier than thou, like unholier than thou. Because they were worried about going to hell and I wasn't. And that did give me a sense of being in a better place than they were. But in fact, I had no idea what God could mean. It wasn't until later when I became an ardent feminist and really started to translate, the language of patriarchy, that I started to think about this maleness of the God that I heard about. That it was God the Father, and that it was God the punishing Father, it was God the mean Father. And again, that was all about what I was not doing and what I was writing off and saying goodbye to. I came to love God the Mother, the goddess, in my early 20s. And for me, that was all tied up with earth cycles. Here in Minnesota, where I live now and where I lived then, the earth cycles are very dominant. I mean, you really can't ignore them. Right now in Minnesota, it's been really cold. And that takes a whole lot of your heart and soul and body to process when it's that cold. And so when I came to know the mother goddess, I also began practicing the solstices and the equinoxes and really marking the earth cycles. And I have to admit that again, I became a little bit of a fundamentalist, which is to say that I felt like the mother goddess was real and these other kinds of gods that people talked about were not real. And so I lived there for a few years, and that was a wonderful, nurturing place for me. But at some point, that kind of us, them, we've got the truth, they don't, kind of began to crunch in on me again and to feel constraining. After my mind expanded a little bit about God being everywhere, I decided to go to seminary. I went to a Christian seminary, which was new for me. And so I found myself thinking about God in a lot of traditional ways that honestly I'd never thought about before. One thing I learned in seminary was that God the bully, who I thought was the Christian God, was only one of the Christian gods. And in fact, the God that the people in my seminary knew and loved was not a bully, was in fact quite similar to what I was understanding to be the loving force of the universe that was really holding all of us and creating beauty and sustaining us. That was quite something for me to learn over and over. I would dare to say something thinking that, the Christians in the room would scream and say, ah, and they would go, well, yeah, sure, I agree with that. And so being there really relaxed me about the use of the word God. Now I can honestly say, God is a word for me. It's a name for what's holy. It's not the name that primarily opens the door for me, but it's also not a word that shuts doors for me. It's a word that I use when it will communicate with somebody because they use it, and it's a word that I don't use if it will block communication with somebody. Because ultimately, what I know now is that we're all held in a love so big that it really doesn't care what we call it. And so I don't worry about that. What I do focus my energy on is staying in touch with that deeper reality that holds me, that holds planets in place, that holds the moon in its cycle, and really feeling myself to be connected to everything. Because that's my primary way of thinking, I've found Buddhist thinking to be the most helpful for me. And Buddhist thinking doesn't really hold a God apart from all of that interconnectedness. But many Buddhist teachers use language of God because it communicates. And so, I don't know if this is helpful or not, but really, it's not that I'm agnostic, because agnostic would say, I don't know if God is or isn't. It's not that for me. I know that there's something big and loving and has so much love that it won't let me go. I know that I'm beloved on this earth. I just don't care whose name is given. I just don't think that God is a brand name that we have to use. So that's my journey. I wonder if you see yourself in any part of that.